The termination letter was still sitting unsigned on the hospital administrator's desk. When Rowan Beckett walked out of St. Callum Medical Center for the last time, carrying nothing except a worn canvas jacket and the small dinosaur figurine his 9-year-old sons had tucked into his coat pocket that morning. "For luck, Dad, so your patients feel better." Behind him, department heads whispered that he had finally cracked under pressure. Some called it burnout. Others said it was foolish, reckless even, to walk away from a senior surgical nursing position without anything lined up, especially as a single father with a mortgage in Mississauga and a kid who still needed new winter boots before November. But none of them understood why he really left. None of them had seen the texts he deleted every night so his son wouldn't find them. None of them knew about the Tuesday 3 months earlier when he had stood in the hospital stairwell at 11:40 p.m., not crying, just completely empty. The way a house feels after someone has moved all the furniture out, and you realize how loud silence actually is. And while the automatic doors slid shut behind him, Rowan's phone buzzed with a message from the after-school program coordinator saying his son, Eli, not the one from the file, a different Eli, his Eli, had been waiting in the lobby for 40 minutes, because his father had forgotten again to arrange a pickup. Rowan sat in his car in the parking garage for a long time before starting the engine. He had spent 14 years working inside St. Callum, one of the largest regional hospitals in the Greater Toronto Area. He started as a floor nurse at 26, fresh from his second placement, quiet and focused in a way that made senior staff either trust him immediately or find him unsettling. Over the years he built a reputation that required no self-promotion. Surgeons requested him by name. Patients asked for him on return visits. He trained new cohorts with the patience of someone who genuinely believed every person in that building, nurse, orderly, porter, patient, deserved to be treated with care, and for a long time, that belief was enough to keep him going. His wife, Marguerite, died 2.5 years before he resigned. Pancreatic cancer, fast and without mercy, the way that particular illness tends to be. She had been a high school art teacher in Brampton. She painted watercolors on Sunday mornings at the kitchen table, while their son pushed toy cars across the floor, and Rowan made coffee he always let go cold, because he kept stopping to watch them both. He thought about that kitchen table more than he could explain to anyone. Not with grief exactly. Grief had its own shape, and he had learned to carry it. But with the specific ache of understanding that some ordinary mornings are actually the best thing that will ever happen to you. And you don't know it until they're gone. After Marguerite died, Rowan reorganized his entire existence around two things: his son, and the job that paid for his son's life. He set alarms for 5:15 a.m., he learned which cereal had to be the exact same brand every week or there would be an argument. He attended every parent-teacher interview, every Thursday swim lesson at the community center, every single birth party his son was invited to. Standing at the edge of the gymnasium in his coat, because the hospital had paged him, and he wasn't sure how long he could stay. He gave the job everything he had left after being a father, and for a while, the hospital gave back. Flexibility where it could, a team that covered for him when school called, colleagues who understood without needing it explained. But hospitals change, administrations change, budget cycles arrive, and the language shifts from patient care to patient throughput, from staff wellness to staff productivity metrics. A new executive director arrived at St. Callum 18 months after Marguerite died, and within a year the culture inside the building felt different, in the way that weather feels different before a storm. Not dramatic, just heavier, and wrong in a way you can't quite name until you're already soaked. Rowan's requests for schedule adjustments were denied twice in the same quarter. Mandatory overtime was made effectively non-optional through the kind of institutional pressure that never quite puts anything in writing. He raised concerns about staffing ratios at a team meeting, and was told, in front of 8 colleagues, that everyone was managing, and perhaps the issue was personal bandwidth. He didn't respond. He wrote it down in a small notebook he kept in his locker. The way you do when you know something is being slowly taken from you. And you want a record of exactly how it happened. The morning he resigned, he had just come off a double shift covering for 2 colleagues who had both called in sick on the same day. The third time that had happened in 6 weeks, because the unit was chronically understaffed and everyone knew it, and no one above them was willing to say it plainly. He drove to the after-school pickup 40 minutes late, and found his son sitting on the front steps of the building, in October cold, backpack on his lap, the dinosaur figurine already in his coat pocket, even though the morning had not yet required luck. His son looked up and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked very quietly whether Rowan had forgotten about him. Rowan said no. He said he was sorry. He said work had gone long. His son nodded like a child who had already decided to stop being surprised by that answer, and something about that particular nod, that small, resigned, 9-year-old nod, moved through Rowan in a way he could not contain or explain, or manage into something professional. He put his son in the car. He drove home. He made dinner. He helped with homework, and read 2 chapters of the book they were working through together, and sat on the edge of the bed, until he was certain his son was asleep. Then he went to the kitchen and wrote the resignation letter on the back of an unopened electricity bill, because he didn't want to waste good paper on something this straightforward. He submitted it electronically at 1:17 a.m. and slept better than he had in months. The executive director of St. Callum Medical Center was a woman named Helena Voss. She was 41 years old, held a doctorate in Health Systems Administration from the University of Toronto, and had spent the previous 7 years restructuring mid-sized hospitals across Ontario, with a precision that the board found impressive, and the nursing staff found exhausting. She was not cruel. She was not indifferent. She was in the specific way of people who have spent too long looking at systems, rather than the people inside them. Profoundly disconnected from the difference between those two things. When HR informed her that Rowan Beckett had resigned, she asked one question: was he current on his patient handover documentation? They confirmed he was. She moved to the next item on her agenda. 11 days later, the surgical unit entered the worst staffing crisis in St. Callum's recent memory. 3 senior nurses left within the same week. 2 to competing hospitals offering signing bonuses. 1 to early retirement after a workplace injury claim that had been mishandled for 4 months. The unit that had been strained became instantly unsustainable. Surgical wait times climbed. An adverse incident occurred during a post-operative monitoring gap, and, while the patient recovered, the report landed on Helena's desk like a door slamming in an empty house. She called a meeting with department heads. She commissioned a capacity review. She approved emergency overtime at significant cost. And through all of it, one name kept appearing in the background of every solution someone proposed. Not as a hero, not as a miracle, but as the kind of professional presence whose absence reveals exactly how much invisible weight they had been carrying. Rowan Beckett. Helena was not a woman accustomed to reconsidering decisions. In her professional experience, reconsideration was often just hesitation, dressed in thoughtful language. But this was different, and she was self-aware enough to know it. The unit had not simply lost a nurse. It had lost the load-bearing wall inside a structure that was now visibly shifting. She did not send an email. She did not have HR make the call. She found his home address in the personnel file. And on a Thursday evening in early November, when the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees, and the first real bite of Canadian winter was making itself known, she drove herself across the city. The neighborhood surprised her. Not because it was rough. It wasn't, but because it was so ordinary in the specific way that good, quiet, undervalued lives tend to be ordinary. A row of semi-detached houses, on a street where someone had planted maples that were now too large for the space between the sidewalk and the curb, dropping leaves in damp clumps across the pavement. A hockey net at the end of one driveway. A bicycle locked to a porch railing. Rowan's house had a jack-o'-lantern still sitting on the front step. 3 weeks after Halloween, slightly collapsed on one side. There was a light on in the window above the door. She knocked. He answered in a gray Henley and work socks, holding a half-eaten piece of toast, because apparently it was breakfast for dinner night, which she would learn later was a Thursday tradition. He had started the month after Marguerite died because his sons had asked for pancakes at 7 in the evening. And Rowan had decided that was a perfectly reasonable thing to want. He looked at her without surprise. Not because he expected her, he didn't, but because a man who has been through genuine loss stops being shocked by the appearance of uncomfortable things. "Dr. Voss," he said. "Mr. Beckett." She paused. "I apologize for coming to your home." He stepped back and opened the door slightly wider, which she understood was not warmth but was at least decency. From the kitchen, a voice called out, "Dad, the syrup is running out. There's another bottle under the sink." Rowan called back, not looking away from her. Helena stepped inside. The house was small and not particularly tidy, but it had the particular warmth of a place that is genuinely lived in, rather than maintained. Drawings on the refrigerator held with mismatched magnets. A pair of winter boots by the door that were one size too small. She noticed because the tongue was bent outward from being forced on. Books stacked on the stairs, a dinosaur figurine on the hallway table beside a pile of school forms. His son appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a plastic bottle of maple syrup upside down to gauge how much was left, and looked at Helena with the frank, measuring stare of a child who has learned to assess adults quickly.
"Hi," he said.
"Hi," said Helena. He turned back to his pancakes. Rowan apologized briefly for nothing specific, and gestured her toward the living room, where she sat on the edge of an armchair that had seen better decades, and explained the situation at the hospital. She was precise, as she always was. She used the correct technical language. She outlined the scope of the problem and the specific gap his absence had created. Rowan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The staffing ratios I flagged in August. Yes, I put that in writing. I know." Another pause. "I raised it 3 times," he said. Not with anger, with the flat clarity of a person stating a fact they would like acknowledged before moving forward. "I know that too," Helena said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said that he was sorry for what was happening at the unit, genuinely, because he knew exactly who bore the weight of it, and it wasn't the administration. But he had made a choice. For the first time in 2 years, his son had a father who was present. That morning they had walked to school together, and talked about whether penguins could theoretically survive in northern Ontario if climate change continued at current projections, which was apparently a science class debate topic, and Rowan had realized during that conversation that he did not know what his son's current science unit was about. He had not known, for months, what his son was learning in school. That was the kind of information that fell through the cracks of double shifts and mandatory overtime, and a system that treated a senior nurse's personal life as a scheduling inconvenience. He was not going back to that. Helena did not have a response that felt adequate. She had come prepared to negotiate, salary increase, schedule accommodations, a formal acknowledgement of the concerns he had raised. But sitting in that living room, with the sound of a 9-year-old methodically finishing pancakes in the kitchen, and a collapsed jack-o'-lantern rotting gently on the front step, she found the language of negotiation inadequate in a way she couldn't quite explain. She thanked him for his time. She stood to leave. From the kitchen doorway, his son appeared again. He had syrup on his chin. He looked at Helena with that same frank, measuring expression, and said, "Are you trying to get my dad to come back to work?" Helena, who had chaired board meetings and faced parliamentary committee questions, and delivered the news of hospital restructuring to rooms full of people whose livelihoods were affected, found she could not immediately answer a 9-year-old's direct question. "I was trying to talk to him about it," she said finally. The boy considered this. "He works really hard," he said. "He's a really good nurse." Then he went back to his pancakes. Helena drove home in silence. She did not turn on the radio. In the weeks that followed, Rowan started finding his way back to a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. He picked up shifts at a small private clinic in Port Credit, 4 days a week, predictable hours, a 15-minute drive from school. He was overqualified and underpaid, and didn't care even slightly. He coached his son's floor hockey team on Saturday mornings, at the community center. He started sleeping before midnight. The financial pressure was real. His savings were not designed for an open-ended career change. He sold the second car, a practical decision, not a dramatic one, and switched grocery stores and began examining every bill the way people do when they've crossed the line from comfortable discomfort into actual worry. One afternoon in late November, he quietly transferred the last of a small investment account his wife had left him into the checking account to cover December's mortgage, and then sat at the kitchen table for a while, looking at the withdrawal confirmation on his phone's screen. He did not tell his son. What he did tell his son, that evening, was that they were going to make tourtière from scratch. For the first time, because Christmas was coming and his wife had made it every year, and the recipe was written in her handwriting in a notebook, in the kitchen drawer. And he thought this year they should try. His son looked at the recipe for a long time, tracing the letters. "She wrote in cursive," the boy said. "She always did," said Rowan. "They made the pie badly. The crust cracked, the filling was a little dry." His son declared it the best thing he had ever eaten, which was transparently untrue and completely sincere, and Rowan laughed in the way that only happens when grief and love are so close together. You can't tell which one is which. Helena Voss, in the same weeks, was doing something she had not done in a significant amount of time. She was noticing things. She noticed, for instance, that the remaining senior nurses on her surgical unit were visibly depleted, in a way the productivity dashboards did not capture. She noticed that the break room on the third floor had a coffee machine that had been broken for 6 weeks, and every facility's request to fix it had been deprioritized. She noticed that 2 nurses had submitted schedule accommodation requests for childcare reasons in the past quarter, and both had been declined, without documentation of alternatives offered. She noticed these things because she had spent an evening in a semi-detached house in Mississauga, where a 9-year-old boy had told her his father was a really good nurse, and something about the complete simplicity of that assessment had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter she couldn't reach. Helena had not had an easy path to the position she held. Her own father had told her, when she was 17, and considering healthcare administration, that the only way to survive a system that would underestimate her was to be harder than the system expected. She had taken that advice with total commitment. She had made herself precise, and unreadable, and productive, in ways that occasionally crossed the line into something colder. She had not had a relationship last longer than 14 months in the past decade, because she consistently chose the late meeting over the dinner, the quarterly review over the weekend, the career over everything that didn't fit inside the career. She had believed, without examining it directly, that this was simply what ambition required. She was starting to understand that she had confused ambition with armor. She began a formal review of the hospital's staffing policies. Not a commissioned report, an actual, personal review, reading every submitted accommodation request from the past 2 years, every flagged concern from nursing staff, every exit interview. It took 12 evenings. Devastating in the quiet, cumulative way that documented neglect always is. She found Rowan's written concerns from August. 3 separate memos, each one professional, specific, and completely ignored. She sat with that for a while, then she began drafting a new staffing framework, not as an administrative exercise, but as an act of correction. Reduced mandatory overtime, genuine flex scheduling for parents and caregivers. A formal process for raising clinical concerns, without professional consequence. A staff wellness coordinator role, that had existed only on paper for 3 years, which she converted to a funded, active position within 1 budget cycle. She did not announce these changes publicly, or send a press release. She implemented them because they were right, and the fact that she hadn't done it sooner was something she intended to carry, rather than perform remorse about. And then, in mid-December, on a Tuesday evening, after a board meeting that had run 2 hours over schedule, she drove back to the house on the street with the 2 large maples. The jack-o'-lantern was gone. There was a string of lights along the porch railing. White, not colored, and through the front window she could see the blue glow of a television. She could hear, faintly, the sound of a child laughing at something she knocked. Rowan opened the door. He was wearing the same gray Henley. He looked less tired than he had in November, not fully rested, because single parents of 9-year-olds don't fully rest, but something in his face had loosened. He looked at her for a moment. "I'm not here about the position," she said immediately. He waited. "I'm here because I owe you a direct acknowledgement that I failed in my responsibilities as an administrator, specifically regarding the concerns you raised." 3 times. In writing. She said it the way she had practiced it on the drive over, not as a negotiation tactic, not as a preamble to an ask, but as an actual statement of fact she needed to deliver to the correct person. "What happened to you at this hospital, and to your colleagues, was a failure of leadership. It was my failure, and I'm sorry." Rowan was quiet for long enough that she wasn't sure what was coming. "Do you want to come in?" he said finally. "We have leftover tourtière." Fair warning, it's not very good. From somewhere inside the house his son's voice called out, "It's actually terrible, she should know." Rowan looked faintly mortified. Helena laughed, a real one, sudden and uncurated, the kind that happens before you've decided to allow it. It startled her slightly. She came inside. She came back 3 more times before Christmas. Not always with a purpose. Once, because she had a question about the new staffing framework, and thought his clinical perspective would be useful, which was true and also only partially the reason. Once because she had driven past the street, and found herself turning onto it, before she had consciously decided to. Once because his son had extracted a promise, the second time she visited, that she would come to his floor hockey game at the community center, and Helena Voss did not break promises to children. She stood at the side of the gym in her work coat, watching 9 and 10-year-olds chase a ball around a polyurethane floor with a level of intensity that was both impressive and deeply uncoordinated. And she thought about what it meant to be somewhere without an agenda. She had not been somewhere without an agenda in so long that she was not entirely sure how to do it. She was figuring it out. Rowan coached from the bench with the calm, specific encouragement of someone who had spent years teaching people in high-pressure situations without raising his voice. His son played with an abandon that suggested total indifference to the score. They won anyway. After the game, walking back to the parking lot in the December cold with her breath fogging in front of her, Helena said, without planning to, that she envied him. He glanced at her. She kept walking. "You seem like you know exactly where you are," she said. "I spend most of my time feeling like I'm managing a set of variables. I don't know when I stopped thinking about the people inside the variables." He didn't answer immediately. They reached his car first. His son was ahead of them, already trying to fit his hockey stick into the back seat in a way that was geometrically impossible. "I think," Rowan said finally, "it happens when the cost of feeling things starts to look higher than the cost of not feeling them, and you don't notice you've made that trade until someone else points at what you're missing." He helped his son with the hockey stick. He looked back at her. "The people in your hospital," he said. "They didn't leave because the work wasn't worth doing. They left because they stopped feeling worth protecting." She thought about that the entire drive home. She thought about it while she stood in her condo on the 42nd floor of a building in the financial district, looking out at the Toronto skyline, the lakes frozen at its edges in the December dark. Her apartment was expensive and clean, and completely without evidence that any particular person lived there. No drawings on the fridge, no cracked jack-o'-lantern, no recipe in a dead woman's handwriting tucked in a kitchen drawer. She had worked very hard for this apartment. She was not sure it had ever felt like a home. The new year came. January in Ontario was January in Ontario, grey, cold, long, the kind of month that tests what people actually believe about their own resilience. The hospital's new staffing policies went into effect on the 1st of the month. A nurse who had been considering leaving for 3 years approached Helena in the hallway and said, quietly, that the flax scheduling change had made it possible for her to keep the job and still pick up her kids on Tuesdays. Helena thanked her. She felt it differently than she had expected to. In February, she formally offered Rowan his position back. Not the same position, a new one, with genuine authority over clinical staffing decisions in the surgical unit, a schedule structured around school hours, and a compensation package that for the first time reflected what his work was actually worth to the institution. She put it all in a letter, a real one, on paper which felt important. She also included on a separate page in her own handwriting, something that was not part of any official offer. She wrote that she understood if he chose not to return. She wrote that regardless of his decision, the changes at the hospital would continue because they were correct. Not because she needed something from him. She wrote that she was grateful for every moment he had allowed her into the small, particular world of his family. And that she had not fully understood, before knowing him, what it meant to build something that mattered out of the daily, unspectacular work of just being present for the people who needed you. Then she wrote one more line, separate from the rest, because it needed to stand on its own. She wrote, "I would like to keep knowing you, not as a colleague, as a person. If that's something you'd consider, I think you already know I'm asking." She folded the letter. She drove to Mississauga. She stood on his porch in February dark, in a coat that was warm enough for a Toronto winter, but maybe not quite warm enough for standing still on a porch waiting for a door to open, and she knocked. He opened the door. He read the official offer first, standing in the doorway with the cold coming in, because he was a practical man and the practical portion needed to land first. Then he read the second page. He read it twice. Behind him, from somewhere in the house, his son's voice, "Dad, who is it?" "Dr. Voss," Rowan called back. A pause. Then, with the particular enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who has made a unilateral decision about someone's importance in his life, "Is she staying for dinner? Tell her she has to stay for dinner." Rowan looked at her. Something in his face had changed in the reading of those pages. Not dramatically, not in the way movies arrange faces, but in the small, real way of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and has just been offered permission to set it down for a moment. "He'll take that personally if you say no," he said. "I know," she said. He stepped aside. She came in out of the cold. It did not become simple after that. Simple was not what either of them had the capacity for, and they both understood that without having to say it. Rowan had grief that was not finished yet and probably never would be entirely finished, only integrated. Carried differently as time passed, like shifting a heavy bag from one shoulder to the other, still heavy, just less lopsided. Helena had a decade of self-protective distance to unlearn, which turned out to be the kind of work that requires patience, and the willingness to be interrupted at inconvenient moments by feelings you have trained yourself to defer. But they were both, in their different ways, people who knew how to do hard things without making a spectacle of the difficulty. That turned out to be enough to build on. Rowan returned to St. Callum in March. The unit was different, not fixed, because hospitals are not fixed, only improved or deteriorated at varying rates. But the direction was correct, and the people inside it could feel the difference. He ran the staffing process with the same quiet authority he brought to everything, and twice in the first month he submitted formal concerns, through the new clinical governance process, and both times received a written response within the committed timeline. He kept the notebook in his locker. He stopped needing to use it. His son, who had spent 2.5 years observing adults manage grief and transition with varying degrees of honesty, adapted to the changes in his father's life with the pragmatic flexibility of a child, who has always had to understand more than children should have to. He liked Helena, he said once, without ceremony, while she was helping him with a school project about Canadian ecosystems, that she was different when she wasn't at the hospital. Helena asked him what she was like at hospital. He thought about it seriously. "Like when you're really concentrating on something important," he said. "But here, you're more like when you're watching the penguins at the zoo. Less concentrating, more just looking." She thought that was one of the more accurate things anyone had ever said about her. The staffing wellness coordinator, hired under Helena's new framework, turned out to be one of the best appointments in the hospital's recent history. Within 18 months, the surgical unit staff retention rate was the highest it had been in 6 years. The board cited operational improvements. Helena accepted their acknowledgement with the knowledge that the actual cause was not an operational strategy, but the specific cost of ignoring the person in front of you for too long. Learned from a nurse in work socks, holding a piece of toast on a November evening. On a Saturday in April, a clear, sharp-edged spring day when the light off Lake Ontario has a quality that makes you understand why people choose to live somewhere that tests them for 5 months every year. Rowan and his son and Helena stood outside on the waterfront in Port Credit. The boy was trying to convince a duck to come closer. The duck was uninterested. Helena had brought coffee from the place around the corner, and Rowan's had gone cold because he kept stopping to watch his son approach the dock's edge with the cautious, absolute confidence of a child who is certain the adults behind him will catch him if anything goes wrong. The certainty was not unfounded. Standing there in the April sun, in a city that had tested all three of them in different ways, and for different reasons, Rowan understood something he hadn't been able to name for years. He was not surviving anymore. He was present, fully, specifically, unremarkably present, the kind of presence that looks like nothing from the outside and feels, from the inside, like everything. He was not the same person he had been before Marguerite died. He would never be. But grief had not hollowed him out the way he had feared. It had very slowly and without his permission, made more room in him for things he hadn't expected to feel again. The duck waddled away. His son turned back toward them with the expression of someone reassessing strategy. "I need bread," the boy announced, "for next time." "Noted," said Rowan. Helena handed him the last of her coffee, without being asked, because she had noticed his was cold. And she had started noticing things, and he took it, and they stayed there a while longer, watching the lake.